Greetings, I'm Shad, and in this video I'm going to be telling you what a castle is. Now, you might think that you know what a castle is, but the question is a little bit more complex than you might think, and I don't mean to try and complicate things, I'm just here to try and share a bit of fact and truth to you. And I feel this is necessary because when you look at other structures that are, say, similar to castles, like a fortress, a stronghold, a citadel, or a chateau, people often confuse these structures as castles, and vice versa. So first off, let me just explain something, okay? Now, a castle, a real castle, and I'll get to what a real castle is, but let me just say this. A castle, if it is a real castle, is at the same time a fortress, a stronghold, a chateau, and it can be a citadel. Not all castles are citadels, but it can be. Having said that, fortresses, strongholds, chateaus, and citadels are not always castles. Okay, so then what is a castle? Well, the term has evolved, and in the common vocabulary in our modern day, people use the term castle to refer to any building that has medieval-style battlements on it. Because people would call this building a castle, or this building a castle. Why? Because they look like a castle. Why do they look like a castle? They have medieval-style battlements on them. Well, let me address that, because I can't really fight against how the term is used in our current day today. And in all honesty, I found myself using that term as well. It's a castle house, or something like that. But what I really do, I put another qualification to the word. It's a castle something or a something castle, but because in my mind I know they are not real castles. So then, what is a real castle? Well, a real castle, okay, is two things. It has to cover these two kind of roles. It has to do these two things for it to be, in my mind, a real castle. First of all, it needs to be a building capable of repelling invaders or attackers. Well, an invader is an attacker. So it has to have fortifications sufficient enough to repel attackers. That's the first thing, because just having that doesn't make it a castle, okay? But it needs that. That's the first thing. The next thing, it needs to be a legitimate residence. A person actually has to live there for it to be a legitimate castle. So they will raise children there, they will eat breakfast, have dinner, do all their, all the daily things that a person would do in their daily life in their home. A castle needs to be able to allow for those things to be done for it to be a real castle. And if you have those two things covered, what you have then is a legitimate castle. Now, do castles need to be built out of stone? Well, in my mind, that certainly adds effectiveness to its ability to repel invaders. The old Motte and Bailey, the first kind of castles that really came about, a lot of them were made out of wood, but they didn't stay wood for very long, because wood has a very significant weakness. It burns, so it doesn't really cover that need or the ability to repel attackers, invaders, very well. And that's my next point. This structure's ability to repel invaders needs to actually be very, very effective. It can't just have thick walls and that's it. Every single thing about its design needs to be built around repelling invaders for it to be a legitimate castle in my mind. If it has, say, massive weaknesses, like big open windows on the first floor level that people could just smash and get in, then that kind of undermines its whole very ability to repel invaders. And therefore, in my mind, isn't a real castle anymore. So that's what a castle is. Now, let's define the difference between a castle and a fortress, a stronghold, a citadel, and a chateau. Well, a fortress is fairly straightforward. It is a structure that can repel invaders, attackers, but it doesn't need to fulfill the ability to house people. It doesn't need to be a residence. So a castle, because it can repel invaders, is very much a fortress. In fact, any real castle will at the same time be a fortress. But a fortress doesn't need to fulfill that residential requirement at all. A fortress is specifically a military structure. Now, it needs to be said that you would be very, very hard-pressed to find a fortress in the medieval period that didn't function as someone's residence at the same time, meaning it'd be very difficult to find a fortress that wasn't a castle. Because every single structure that functioned as a fortress, like I said, was basically someone's residence as well. Therefore, castles were the main thing. The period where you actually get pure fortresses separate to castles is really after the medieval period, when the feudal system went out of practice, meaning that nations had private armies. So the armies weren't provided by the nobles and the feudal lords and things like that. They were trained, funded and maintained purely by the monarchy. And when you had national armies, then you would have fortresses for those armies purely for a military purpose, and you wouldn't have citizens, even the noble elite citizens or the feudal lords, living in those fortresses at the same time. Hence, they became military fortresses and not castles. And it was also in this time that the feudal lords, the noble elite of society, their homes started to evolve as well, to less being actual castles to more being mansions. But we'll get to that, because this is where the concept of chateaus really comes in. So yes, just saying again, you'd be hard-pressed to find a fortress that wasn't a castle in the medieval period. So that's what a fortress is, but what about a stronghold? Well, technically, every fortress is a stronghold, so that also means every real castle is also a stronghold. What is a stronghold? Well, it can be a fortress, but not every stronghold is a fortress or a castle. The best way I can define a stronghold is a place of security. Okay, so that doesn't mean it has to be a fortress. It can be a hidden place like a bunker with food and supplies. That is also a stronghold. So any place or area that can legitimately be a place of security is, in my opinion, by definition, a stronghold. Okay, now let's look at Citadel. Now, Citadel is kind of the odd one because not every castle is a citadel. So, what is a citadel? A citadel is the core fortified area of a town or city specifically, okay? So therefore, a citadel could be a castle, or it could be a fortress, so no one living there permanently at all, or it could be a fortified town centre. You see, the very term citadel comes from the term city. It actually means little city. Why would they call it little city? Well, it's a smaller part of the city, but it's a crucial part. It's the part that protects the larger part of the city. The absolute best example of a castle that is also a citadel is Canavan Castle. Canavan Castle was built to protect the town of Canavan, and it is the citadel of the town city of Canavan. And the reason why it is a castle is because it is also a residence, and in fact it was also a palace. And actually that's another word that we should probably define what a palace is, and that's obvious. A palace is any place where a royalty lives, a monarch. But not every palace is a castle, and not every castle is a palace. Okay, a castle only becomes a palace if a monarch is actually living in that castle. But more often than not, especially after the Renaissance period, most palaces were not castles at all because they weren't fortified. They were mainly built as symbols of great wealth and majesty, and they were built within such fortified areas, like within the walls of a city or something like that, that it didn't need to be a castle itself because there was so much protection and defense surrounding the palace. Okay, last but not least is the term chateau, or if I try and say it in a French accent, chateau. Anyway. Now, I've left the word chateau last because it can be a bit tricky, okay? Because chateau is legitimately the French word for castle. So you would think just by the very meaning of the word, every chateau is then a castle. Well, not necessarily, because clarification needs to be made, and also we need to address how that word was used and also evolved to be used. So to start with, yes, of course, it translates literally to castle, and it was generally defining the place where the noble elite lived. And when the noble elite started to live less in fully fortified structures and more in mansions, country houses, really fancy buildings and stuff like that, the term carried over. And also the reason why it carried over is because these country houses, these mansions, still looked very castle-like. They had what appeared to be battlements on them, but these battlements were aesthetic battlements. They weren't legitimate fortifications that could be used for defense. For instance, a lot of the crenellations you'll see on these mansions and stuff like that have no ramparts behind them, and the merlons on the crenellations aren't big enough to cover a full person's height, which is what they need to be an effective merlon. And if you're wondering what these terms are, please watch my video, the definition of the names and terms of the parts of a castle. So all these battlements and stuff like that are purely aesthetic. They're there so the building still looks castle-like. Why? Because noble people lived in castles. It was a sign of prestige, and they wanted that sign to carry over to their less fortified and military homes. And this is really what the word chateau means today. It means a mansion or a country house. And the reason why this word has changed to mean this is because an additional kind of qualification is put on chateau to mean an actual home that has legitimate fortifications, and is the term fort. And so in French, as I understand it, if you are referring to a legitimate castle that can repel invaders and everything like that, they would call it a chateau fort. Not just a chateau, such as the Chateau Fort de Roquetaillade. A wonderful example of a French castle, but it has also undergone extensive renovations that has actually changed some of those fortifications, which almost edges it off the, definition of a castle. Like, they replaced the arrow slits with larger windows and stuff like that, but it is mostly still very much a legitimate castle. And to define it as such, it's called a chateau fort, specifically. And this is the definition that I want to try and convey to you. A chateau really defines a residence that has castle-style aesthetics on it. And because a legitimate castle has those aesthetics, but they're real fortifications instead of being just there for looks, a castle then, by definition, is also a chateau as well. But not every chateau is a legitimate castle. And a better way to define it is to call a real castle a chateau fort, and a mansion, and even if the mansion doesn't look like a castle, it's just a fancy mansion, and as well, if it does have castle aesthetics on it, just to call those structures a chateau. And this kind of confusion is the very confusion that exists in the world today, because people will look at chateaus and call them castles even though they're not real castles, and in the same way you could look at a castle and call it a chateau even though it's not really just a home. Therefore, the way I would define it is to call real castles castles and stop calling chateaus castles. They're not real castles. Let's use the term chateau just for the fancy mansions or houses that look castle-like, and let's call real castles castles. Because a castle is specifically a residence and a home that can legitimately repel attackers and invaders for long periods of time. I hope this has cleared up some things. I hope you've learnt something from watching this video, or at the very least, I hope you have enjoyed. A big thank you to Drone Girl for letting me use some of her footage. Drone Girl uses remote-controlled drones to film some of the castles in Ireland. Please go check her out if you're interested. She has created some wonderful videos. Thank you for watching. I wish you all the best, and until next time, farewell.